if I go back to my epistemology, there's the kind of image I could make of you have two given variables, and they determine the third one. So you just know of the three corners of a triangle, you just need to know two of them, and the third one is given. Mm. This is the base of all epistemology and economics. Give me two independent variables, supply and demand, and I will know the third one, price. Because to come back to the image you used earlier, and which we'll probably come to, when Adam Smith said price is a function of supply and demand, he's simply saying here are two independent variables, and they give you the third one. That's what price is a function of supply and demand means. And Steiner, if we can make this little side tour at the moment, when you talked about lecture 8, what he's talking about in there is very precisely this, that he says that the whole theory of supply and demand based on price as a function of supply and demand, this is where this comes from Adam Smith, in the sense that Adam Smith described this. It's the kind of the economics of a mercantilist time and a man of the time, Adam Smith. And it's looking at, and if you analyze it, it's saying you have two independent variables giving you the third dependent variable. And now you have an image of the epistemology of prices of function of supply and demand. And then Steiner said that's good as far as it goes. And that's the problem with Adam Smith. He should have gone further. He should have been able to say, price and demand give you supply. Price and supply give you demand. He should have been able to go all the way around this triangle and from every side of it, say, I've got two independent variables giving me a third dependent. And if you keep going around the triangle, you'll end up in a world of multiple independent variables. And now you're caught. And this is what he says in lecture 8. This is why Adam Smith, the way he thought, was not apt to his subject matter. Not the way he began to think, so to speak. But if you keep going around this threesome, because it's a very important threesome, you will then realize, in fact, you live in a world of multiple independent variables. And the one that's missing in all this is you in the middle. So if you take anything, it doesn't matter whether it's price is a function of supply and demand, or supply is a function of price and demand, doesn't matter which threesome you take. The dependent variable is hiding you. Because if you now come into a world of multiple independent variables, not just two, your awareness is going to have to make all this work. That's why I gave the example, if you build a house, there isn't any magic dependent variable. There is you, who's going to have to synthesize all this lot as it keeps moving. It's never static. There's no general equilibrium, as Soros points out. Nice idea that we start with balance. But for Soros, balance is an occasional moment. You know, when you agree the price, you have a moment of balance. The rest of it is just lack of balance. That's his problem with general equilibrium theory. It's just all backwards. And so when you get into these kind of things, it's complicated because the missing piece is me, who's not a dependent variable, surrounded by independent variables, multiple ones, who don't have any way of speaking to each other. And there's no thinking device, there's no heuristic device, like price is not just price as a function of supply and demand, but I mean this drawing, give me two axes, price and quantity and supply and demand curves. This is a very powerful image that's used in every economics textbook since Samuelson in 1947. But we have to thank people like John Hicks in the 30s who took this nice idea, or even this equation, and made it visible. Because once you see this on the blackboard, give me two axes, and I can work out the curves and so on. And if the price changes and then everything moves around, I know a new price. Once you have this image, you will never forget this image. You won't even know what it's saying, but it's burning into your mind a whole way of understanding, which is simply not apt. Because in that way of understanding, no human consciousness is needed. by definition. It replaces human consciousness and human intervention, which is then described as noise. Or if you're lucky, you're an outlier, but you're never going to be trend. And all this is incredibly important to understand if you want to kind of understand what Steiner's getting at. He's constantly saying, when you come into a single world economy, none of the epistemology of separate states operates, which is what this epistemology is. You can do this if you're separate from the rest of the universe, but in a single world economy, you are part of the universe. And so you can have no epistemology that does this. The most you can do is just kind of keep going around the triangle until you find yourself in that universe and not apart from it. It's also what he says about the economists and economics. There's no way economics can ground itself on the science of the laboratory, where you put something inside a retort and you watch it from outside. He's very clear, if you want to match the science of economics to that kind of science, you have to get inside the retort and watch yourself being boiled and precipitated and whatever else is going to happen to you inside this little glass tube. Then you can make an analogy to hard science, right?
So but can we take this example of of selling vegetables in the market and just play with the triangle for a moment and see how demand, for example, is a function of price and supply, and just turn the triangle around?
Not really, because if you go, if you've been in a business school, that's what you would try and do, because you think this theory is primary. But I would say, forget it. If you're in a market stall, you have on your hands, you need to clear your stall profitably before the end of the day or before the rain comes or whatever. Put yourself in a stall, right? And you're surrounded by people who are savvy as hell, and they're all protecting their balance sheets, and they're all competing you against the other guy, right? This is what happens. Anyone especially in the market, that you're the fifth stall they've come to, and they're about to make their buying decision, right? They're not thinking of supply and demand, nothing, right? They want to get the best they can for their money to protect their own balance sheet, and that's what you're trying to do. So Steiner makes it very clear, he's not the only one because it's obvious, that the fact that the stallholder, if he's got a tax regime in the background, is having to keep accounts, right? Don't think the customers are not doing that. They're not doing it outwardly, but they're doing it in their own minds. So in fact, you have two people protecting their balance sheets, and they're both in the same world then. They both have income, they have to keep their income above their expense in order to generate capital. With every transaction, every apple they buy, or every apple someone sells, the purpose from both point of view is this sale or this purchase of this apple, this transaction, we both have to generate capital through it. The apple is of almost zero significance. That's incidental to how we generate capital in each of our balance sheets. If we don't make it clear that the buyer and the seller are both doing their accounts and they're actually doing accounts, and we go into how that works, we will not see they live in the same universe. And then all this stuff of supply and demand, you would never use this language. Steiner doesn't use it except to explain how Adam Smith doesn't think clearly enough, right? He doesn't need it to explain his understanding of economic life, in my judgment. So it's a kind of nice idea, but it's not the idea that a real economy, real meaning an economy true to its nature, would come up with. Just wouldn't occur to you. You would know that your income needs to be above your expense. That would occur to you, right? Definitely. You would know that you have to make sure that what you're offering the market is of interest to the market. That would occur to you.
Yeah.
And so on. But when you come to your expense account, everyone who's selling you a service or selling you a good, they're doing the same thing you are. They're making sure that their income is above their expenses. So in that world of what I call associative financial literacy, there's a lot of things that do not occur to you. You never think of selling labor or buying labor, not an idea that would ever arise. You wouldn't ever think of price of supply and demand or price is a function of it. I already showed that in Steiner's image, price, if it's a function of anything, price is a function of two value streams. That's not supply and demand. He didn't talk about that there. So it's quite tricky if you come into technically into economics. There's lots of ideas which economics makes use of, which they don't actually arise in Steiner's lectures. They only get mentioned in order to point out to their inappropriateness. So this is very difficult if you're in a professional, if you're among economists or in a business school, this is all the kind of thing you have to manage or know how to manage. So it's you can ask the question simply, and I would say, I'm answering you as someone who has sold apples in the street. I have been in business where you have to manage these things. And this I've always done alongside. I've done this partly because that's been my life, but partly because all the time since I was, I think, maybe 20, I've been trying to understand what is Steiner meaning in practical terms. So my whole business life has been conducted while I read his lectures. I don't think many people have done this, but for me, it's systematic. For 50 years, systematic. What is he meaning? How do I understand that today in accounting terms? And that's why I speak out of this entrepreneurial experience and the use of accounting to ground his concepts in some practical world, which then doesn't need the notions of buying and selling labor. It doesn't need me to speak against them. I would just talk about get yourself self-employed as fast as you can. You will never think of Marx ever if you go down that path. You might think of the early Marx, but not the late Marx. You would never think of price as a function of supply and demand. You'd never think about that. These are ideas and concepts which just arrive out of the kind of disconnect, really.